so starting now. Today I'm going to be wrapping up chapter 6 on stratification, and I'm going to talk about global inequality and how the different approaches that sociologists, not exclusively sociologists, rather the different social scientific approaches to the analysis, the description, and the kind of background to some of the policy responses that have been adopted by various actors, various groups in response to global inequality. And there are two main theoretical distinctions, or there are two main theoretical focuses on global inequality, and they map on fairly well to the approach that social scientists take to inequality in nation states or in smaller units, and that is, roughly speaking, a functionalist approach, according to which inequality is social inequality, economic inequality, and inequalities of all different kinds are an inevitable consequence of human reality, of the geographical, biological nature on the one hand, or essence or characteristics on the one hand of our planet, and on the other of elements of human nature. And so that inequality is an ineradicable, essential feature of human existence, and that in some case, according to some theorists, as a result of that inevitability, humans have adapted themselves. Human society has adapted itself to that reality, and in a certain sense, turned lemons into lemonade. Another version of the functionalist approach is that in fact inequality is a good thing, and that it's not that it's a mischaracterization of human inequality to describe it as a failure of society. That in framing it that way, there are all kinds of negative, unintended consequences that result from the illusion that equality is a possible way of humans organizing their society. So there's a functionalist approach. And opposed to that functionalist approach is a conflict theory approach, according to which human inequality is the consequence of one of the ways of the way so far that human societies have organized themselves, but at the global level, it's the consequence of how human societies have coordinated their efforts in order to maintain in each nation state economic elites in power, in charge of organizing that society, and through coordinating the national elites, which coordination, when it breaks down, includes going to war and so on. The consequence of those conflicts is to produce and reproduce the current globalizing system that we have. And so that global inequality, like national level inequality, is in fact a mechanism that's adopted and reinforced in the interests of and as a result of the efforts of the economic elites around the world. And the most widely pursued theoretical perspective along those lines is called world systems theory. And so we'll take a look first at the global functionalist account, which is modernization theory, and then we'll compare that to world systems theory. So in order to do that, I'm going to now turn to the slides. Okay. So where are we now? Just a second here. So the textbook has I think an interesting and very helpful kind of graphic to give us an idea of what's actually going on in the world. And it's a little bit dated, but the scale of it certainly hasn't changed. And it describes, it picks and chooses and compares global expenses, global expenditures, rather, in US dollars of a number of different goods and services in order to give us an idea on a global level how different service, how many resources are being either, depending on your point of view and the purpose of your analysis, diverted to, devoted to, invested in, and so on. And so we have here the additional annual cost. How much more money would have to be devoted in order to ensure basic education for everyone in the world? And it would cost $6.3 billion to ensure. Now, what a basic education is for sure open to a great deal of disagreement. But it really, the purpose of this is to indicate the scale. That would only cost an additional $6.3 billion of human global resources. The additional annual cost to make sure that everyone in the world had adequate water and sanitation would be $12.4 billion. Just to put it into perspective, that's in 2012 dollars. And so I'm not good enough at math, and I don't have available at the tip of my fingers the multiplier in order to be able to put that in Canadian in 2021 dollars. But this next week or so in the United States, they're talking about a $2 trillion budget just for well, actually, it's not just for the next year. They calculate it over a number of different time frames, some of it over 10 years and so on. But it's $2 trillion just for the United States. And so the idea that education is important in the world is hard to reconcile with the fact that for relatively speaking, very little money, basic education could be provided to everybody in the world, and basic water. So just for comparison purposes, in the United States, dog and cat food sales, it amounts to, roughly speaking, the same amount of money that would need to be spent to provide water and education and sanitation for everybody in the world who doesn't currently have it. Annual global perfume sales. So we're spending, humans on our planet are spending just on perfume alone almost double the money that it would take to provide water and sanitation for everybody in the world. I suspect that strip club revenue is decreasing. But if we take a look at annual beer sales just in the United States, almost $100 billion a year. And the really significant comparator, though, is annual global arms sales, $1.7 trillion in annual arms sales. And most of those weapons are never discharged. Most of those weapons, in many ways, thankfully, are never ever used. They just gather dust, but they divert available resources away from other kinds of expenses. And so what this represents is a choice that's made. How the choice is made, who the choice is made by, are very much more difficult to get some clarity on. But that it's a choice is, it seems to me, crystal clear. So globally, governments and societies around the world we're spending $1.7 trillion every year on weapons, the majority of which are not personal weapons. Obviously, the majority here is jet planes, nuclear weapons, submarines. These kinds of massive expenditures are diverting. They represent a choice anyway. So we're going to take a look now. How do we explain this distribution of resources? What does it look like? And why does it happen? And why is it so hard to change when many people around the world recognize and acknowledge and understand and proclaim that this is that it's wrong, that is morally wrong to spend that kind of money on weapons. So the two competing accounts are modernization theory, which is a variant of, let me just shrink this so that I can get it all on the slide here. It's an application of a general functionalist account to the fact of global inequality. Modernization theory emerged full-blown as a theory of global inequality after World War II. And here, the geopolitical history makes a difference in understanding how it is that modernization theory came to be and how it came to be an increasingly important focus of social scientific work in universities around the world, in the West and in the rest. So in North American and European universities, and also in universities and research organizations around the world after World War II. Global inequality was increasingly perceived by governments and by social scientists to be a problem. And the reason for that is that the essential conflict theory point was agreed to almost universally, that beyond a certain minimal threshold, global inequality produces instability, government and social instability. And the devastation in all kinds of different ways that World War II represented, perhaps, arguably at least, highlighted by the United States dropping 2 nuclear weapons on Japan, and the fact that soon after the U.S. dropped the nuclear weapons on Japan, a matter of 4 or 5 years later, it became clear that the then Soviet Union had developed nuclear weapons themselves, and there are now, I think, 7 or 8 countries in the world that have acknowledged having nuclear capabilities, having nuclear stockpiles. And so the worst case scenario for global instability is the elimination of humans from our planet. And so even in the last stages of World War II, even before World War II ended, the leaders of the major industrial countries came to the realization and came to an agreement amongst themselves that their own standard of living, their own the quality of life of society in their countries was put at risk by, in part anyway, increased measures of global inequality. And so, for if only self-interested reasons, and this is the connection to functionalism, it was in the interests of the United States, it was in the interests of France, of Great Britain, of Canada, of a number of the countries that were consulted, to try to better understand what the causes of global inequality at the national scales were, and to see what measures could be taken to moderate it, to reduce global inequality, in order to protect, among other reasons, in order to protect the quality of life and the standard of living in the rich countries. And so, in order to do that, social scientists attempted to try to understand how did the degree of global inequality come to reach what it is? How did rich countries distinguish themselves? How did rich countries come to be rich countries? And the conclusion that they reached was that it depended on the pathway through which these countries achieved both democratic models of government and a capitalist economy based on a marketplace. And the conclusion that was reached was that the solution to moderating, not eliminating global inequality, it was never the view of modernization theorists that global inequality could be eliminated absolutely. The claim of what came to be modernization theory was that the global inequality at a level that was likely to destabilize internal markets and international markets could be moderated if the pathway through which, the developmental pathway through which capitalist economies emerged from pre-capitalist economies could be reproduced around the world. And the conclusion that was reached, or the observation that was reached, was that increasing capital investment in agriculture and in quotes, primitive industries would lead over time, with a couple of other adaptations and borrowings, could lead to sustained economic growth. And under the conditions of sustained economic growth, modernization theory holds that all economies can be brought above a certain level of inequality. And so the four elements that were deemed, the result of the analysis was that there were four elements that are required to transform traditional societies into modern societies, characterized by a diminution in a lessening of internal inequality, resulting in a reduction in global levels of inequality. And that was a minimum level of capital investment, the application of marketplace techniques, marketplace strategies to address social problems, the implementation of Western-style democratically elected governance, and a transformation of what, from the point of view of the development theorists, was a backwards traditional mentality based on religion, and the displacement of that traditional mentality by a rational Western science-based mentality. From the get-go, this was explicitly taken to be a social scientific application of what looked to certain of these theorists anyway like an objective description of the course of world history. And the assumption simply was that if the goal is to increase global GDP, or if the goal is to increase national level GDP, gross domestic product, the rational strategy would be to determine under what conditions other instances where gross domestic product was increased, to learn those lessons and to apply those lessons to countries global where the gross domestic product had not increased. And it was simply an application of social science to this, particular problem. And basically, the assumption was that England and then France and Germany and the United States came to be the modern societies that they are through a roughly rational progression of stages. That England in the 10th century, the social organization in England in the 10th century was transformed into England in the late 19th century. Recall or know that at the end of the 19th century, England had the most powerful economy in the world, and it was the wealthiest country in the world, and its economy was growing at the fastest rate, and it was exporting its capital, and it was investing in markets all around the world. England had gone from a backwards agricultural traditional society to a global economic superpower through a number of stages. This was the result of social, scientific, and historical study, and it was broadly agreed that this was simply a description of the facts. So the stages through which modernization theory argues that societies develop are roughly captured in this graphic. Traditional societies, which include hunter-gatherer societies and also pastoral and agricultural societies, typically the model that was taken to develop, or the data, the places that were studied in order to understand this was Europe. So how did Europe become what Europe was? Well, it went from a traditional society, a traditional feudal society, and it became a modern capitalist society. And what did it look like? What did it look like before this transition? Europe in the feudal period had limited technology, low levels of labor productivity, and it was organized on the basis of traditionally transmitted worldview characterized by basically a universally agreed to religious framework. It was an essentially conservative society that had very few mechanisms baked into the social organization, allowing it to adapt. And it was only as a result of major crises, internal and external crises, that forced that society to change. So the Black Death, external invasions, basically broke or almost broke the elements that held those societies together, and on the model of evolution, that is to say, more or less as random mutations of those societies adaptations to those crises led to things like parliamentary democracy and the scientific approach, the scientific, in quotes, the scientific method, and the rationalization of society. As a consequence of those developments, the commercial exploitation of agriculture and eventually extractive industry stimulated and allowed for a population growth and an increase in the technological ability, which together produced a cycle of generations of over all of Europe, several generations in a row of surplus value, of surplus capital that was available for reinvestment. And in traditional society, the surplus value, most of the surplus production was devoted to, spent on luxury items whose effect was and whose purpose was to reinforce the high status position of the aristocratic classes, which reinforced their control over that society. But as an unintended consequence of the other factors which allowed for an increase in the surplus production, such that there was more surplus value created than could be devoted to and spent on and ultimately wasted on luxury items that reinforced the status. So the king could only have so many crowns. And also some of it was diverted to increased cost of war. And an unintended side effect of that was more and more money was spent on improving war technology. And that war technology had derivative improvement effects in agricultural and to a lesser degree initially manufacturing techniques, allowing for a further increase in the productivity of the European economy. And so that while the goal of increasing the ability to wage war was simply the survival of this traditional society, an unintended consequence of those developments was the emergence of a middle class whose status and whose function was separate from, on the one hand, the traditional peasant class, which in traditional European feudal society represented the enormous bulk of that population, 70, 80, 90% of the population, and the tiny fraction of the aristocratic elite. So a middle class emerges with a separate, independent economic and social function. And the consequence of the emergence of this class was that increasingly the surplus value that's produced by the increasingly productive economy is reinvested in the economy instead of diverted to luxury items and status items. And through this internal feedback cycle of reinvesting the surplus value in the economy itself, and the development of this separate class whose own standing doesn't depend on the existing religious structures. The middle class didn't really have a place that was describable in terms of the Christian theology. So they developed their own value systems internal to their own class rule in that society. So the middle class emerges as the most productive class in European society, and their own values focused on achieving and reinforcing and improving their own ability to do their specialized task, which is to organize the labor of the peasant class and to reinvest the results of the increased productivity. What we get is the development of a manufacturing sector. organized no longer on the primary basis of either ensuring increased agricultural production or producing value for the aristocracy, but now a manufacturing sector that's driven by its own imperatives. And its own imperatives are increasingly the production and the realization of profit for the sake of profit. Rather than producing for the sake of society, the manufacturing sector emerges as a self-organized or an internally organized sector whose goal is increasingly no longer producing more hammers and plows and arrows and saddles and so on, but its goal is now increasingly to produce profit. And through transforming the self-understanding of the purpose of an economy, productivity increases relative to earlier human history. Productivity increases at a much greater rate than anywhere else in the world. And so what we get here is, as is described here, eventually in time, we get investment in manufacturing exceeding this threshold of 10% of the national income. And as a result of this, or rather, after this threshold is met, what happens is increasing amounts of labor are diverted from simply ensuring the survival of, so as agricultural technology improves and agricultural productivity increases, fewer and fewer laborers are required to produce the minimum amount of food that's required to ensure the survival of the population. And that labor is now available for what turns out to be much more productive use of human labor, human ingenuity, and human work. And as that labor is diverted away from agriculture into manufacturing and into services, the European economy becomes increasingly productive, and the freed up extra value that's the result of that productivity allows for, or depending on your view, forces them to then expand this system and this approach and this mode of organizing society around the world. So the modernization theory purports to be a neutral, value-free approach to simply understanding and describing how it is that the modern economy emerges in Europe over the course of the 16th, 17th, 18th century. It's neutral. It's intended to be neutral on issues like the role of slavery in this development. The timing of this coincides with the expansion of Europe into Africa and the decision by European traders to shift their investment in Africa from an investment primarily in, or a trade in gold, to a trade in slaves for the purpose of initially the sugar market. Slaves were the first commercial use of slaves by European traders was to develop and expand a sugar market. And the sugar market was driven not by the goal of having more sugar, it was driven by the goal of making more money. And so that capitalist exploitation of slavery is, from a modernization perspective, described the attempt is to describe it in morally neutral terms. And so that's the hallmark of the methodological hallmark of modernization theory is the attempt to treat human issues in a neutral way. And so what happens, the result is that, and here modernization theorists differ amongst themselves about when exactly we would say that modern society emerges, but certainly by the end of World War I, we have all the elements in place for what most modernization theorists agree, virtually all modernization theorists agree, is the modern economic and social world that we live in today. By the end of World War I, the economy is now a fully global economy with telegraph and shipping lines all around the world, with a stock market primarily based in New York and in London, where commodities are exchanged commodities from around the world are bought and sold in central locations. And international trade is now an important component of the national economies of the richest countries in the world. Now, okay, so let me shrink this. Modernization theory was, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, modernization theory emerges when the winning, when at the end of World War II, after the treaty, after Germany and Japan surrender, the leadership of the winners, basically, the main thing they want to avoid was the mistakes that were believed and are still, I think, broadly believed to have been made at the end of World War I. World War I ends. When World War I ends, the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that was imposed on Germany and Austria and all the other losing countries by the winning countries. And the punitive nature of and the economically debilitating nature of the Treaty of Versailles was widely believed by almost all the participants to have, at the very least, increased dramatically the chances of eventual destabilizing of international relations. And so one of the main concerns coming out of World War II was to avoid the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles, and in particular to establish an international, a series of international mechanisms that would enable national level governments to address crises that emerge, economic crises, labor crises, health crises. And so out of World War II emerges a broad consensus among the richest countries in the world that international institutions need to be created that will allow for the sporadic instances of destabilization that are a result, at least partly, of the underlying, from the functionalist point of view, necessary surviving inequality. And so the United Nations is the most well-known of these institutions. But in addition to the United Nations, and in ways overlapping with the United Nations, the Bretton Woods system emerges also out of World War II, and that is an attempt to ensure through international organizations to ensure that nothing like the Great Depression would ever occur again. And the attempt is made to smooth out what is still believed in mainstream economics to be the necessarily cyclical nature of the capitalist business reality. And so the attempt is to coordinate on an international level, to mitigate on an international level the surviving the residual negative consequences of global inequality, without having to resort to and without encouraging war and devastation. That system is, so the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are the two key international institutions that resulted from the Bretton Woods meetings in the 1940s. And that system was in place up until recently. Those institutions still exist, but there has been a breakdown in the consensus, in the theoretical consensus on the basis of which those institutions' roles were developed. And the counter theory, or the alternative, the theoretical framework that gathers the criticisms of the modernization approach are described. One name of it is dependency theory, and dependency theory argues that this. I need to go back to an earlier slide here. Insofar as modernization theory describes global inequality as a result of a lack of capital for investment in the in national markets in poor countries, it dictates a strategy of foreign investment in those national level markets. And the idea was that by investing capital in those markets, the market, the in quotes, genius of the market is, according to mainstream economic theory, that it provides humans with the best system, the best institutionalization for picking and choosing the best ways of devoting labor and resources to human interaction. This is this is what Adam Smith called the invisible hand of the marketplace. If we let, on this theory developed by, among others, Adam Smith, and still in many ways at the core of current consensus in the social sciences, supply and demand are, as far as human history goes, I disagree with this position. I'm just trying to explain it here. Supply and demand are the most efficient way of allocating resources over time. And so the idea is to direct capital in order to inject energy into marketplaces around the world, and by achieving a minimal level of necessary capital investment in those societies, the mechanisms of the marketplace, the mechanism of supply and demand will, it is the most efficient way of channeling human energy and increasing human productivity. Now, what dependency theorists argue is that by injecting capital into these marketplaces, what you also inject is the demand for return of profit. And the demand for that return of profit that is the necessary consequence and the intended consequence even of foreign direct investment, of putting capital from one place into another place, that is to transform those areas from self-subsistent areas into to integrate them into the global economy to the benefit of the people who are to the benefit of those institutions and organizations that are realizing that profit. So what happens is, according to dependency theory, that when massive amounts of capital are devoted to and directed into societies and economies that had not previously had that level of capitalization, those societies are destroyed, and the leftovers are at the mercy of competing social groups, and they rapidly become dependent on that international capital flow to the benefit of the countries from which this capital is being directed. And there are all kinds of well-known examples of this, even as early as the 19th century. US capital was invested heavily in Central and South America, and it was invested in Central and South America largely for the purpose of mineral extraction and agricultural product and productivity. And in many, many cases, it came to be called gunboat diplomacy, and the United States U.S. corporations would invest their money in these Central and South American countries and impose on those countries conditions that were whose intention was and whose goal and whose result was to benefit U.S. capital, U.S. corporations, and secondarily, U.S. society more generally. And so what happens is substantial foreign investment in less developed countries almost, if not in fact immediately, puts those less developed countries at the mercy of the complex relationship between the organizations that run that capital, the multinational corporations, based in and deeply interconnected with national level governments, for the benefit of those corporations. And the interests of those corporations are almost always tied to local, that is to say, US, German, Japanese, British, French national level issues. And over the course of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, it turned out that the most efficient way to translate this foreign investment into economic growth in these less developed countries was to support authoritarian governments rather than reproduce the pre-World War II colonial system of imposing, of having British, French, and primarily British and French, but also German and Belgian and Italian civil servants organizing and running the governments in these developing countries. The decision was reached to transfer that authority from European civil servants to elite components of those societies, on condition that those elite components deliver back to the multinational corporations and the governments that they organize and run, that they deliver profits back to those governments. And so dependency theory argues that the cost to most of these of the societies in most of these developing countries of accepting that foreign investment was a radical and in many cases devastating transformation of their societies, not for the benefit of the population on the ground, but for the benefit of the investors in that foreign investment. And so what has emerged is increasing global inequality, tiny pockets of super wealthy people in these countries, surrounded by an ocean of increasing poverty in those countries, a pattern that the dependency theorists argue it has been reproduced in the national countries themselves. Okay, so now, also, and a third consequence of this is that accompanying this foreign investment, the foreign direct investment in the economy of these developing countries, is an expanded infrastructure, an expanded civil infrastructure whose primary goal is to service that foreign investment at the cost of the local population. And so in order to be able to provide the local infrastructure required to be able to transform that foreign investment into profit, which is the purpose of capital and the goal of capital, and the only way capital operates and exists, that is to turn labor and resources into profit. In order to do that, educational levels had to be raised, health levels had to be raised, and governments borrowed money, often at the urging of and the encouragement of and through the supervision of national level governments and these international institutions that were developed, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, UNICEF, almost always in good faith and with good intentions, hoping to eradicate malaria, hoping to increase literacy and so on, but always, according to dependency theory anyway, ultimately under the conditions that the foreign investment, the foreign capital investment in these marketplaces, in these societies, provides a return on investment that is an advantage to the multinational corporations. And so what happens is, certainly what did happen, whether it happened for these reasons or not, everyone agrees it's just a fact that the governments around the world increasingly borrowed money in order to generate infrastructure, often for the purpose of reducing inequality, often with the goal of reproducing the strategies that did work in many of the currently developed countries. It's widely understood and it's widely believed by both dependency theorists and by modernization theorists that a society benefits from an improved healthcare system and an improved educational system, that the only way to increase productivity, just one second, Kandakar, that investment in the population ultimately is the only strategy that's available for society to move forward. Where there is disagreement is around the extent to which that investment benefits the local population and the extent to which that investment is diverted to the interests of capital and the nations where that capital comes from. Yeah, go ahead. You have a question? Yeah, of course. Okay, so now the main version of dependency theory is known as world systems theory, and it was developed by an English sociologist and historian, Emmanuel Wallerstein, and an Egyptian economist, Samir Amin, and an Italian historian, economist, social scientist, Giovanni Arrighi. Between the three of them, they've developed this very widely articulated, and there's lots of disagreement among the various strands of it, but the central categories developed by world systems theory is that the modern world is divided into three kinds of countries: core countries, peripheral countries, and semi-peripheral countries. The core countries are the richest countries in the world, and they're the source of capital out, and they're where the profit is realized. And they also control the technology. Capital and technology are in some ways two sides of the same coin. Peripheral countries are the poor countries that are the major sources of both raw materials and cheap labor. Both of those are essential components of labor, and materials are the essential components of human material production. And so all economies depend on materials and cheap labor. And in a capitalist economy, cheap labor is the key variable to realizing profit. Keeping labor cheap is the goal of a capitalist period. And so the money is going to chase the least expensive raw materials and the least expensive labor and try to bring those two together in order to satisfy needs that are created or that are realized through the global marketplace. And so initially there are core countries and peripheral countries. And in between the core countries and the peripheral countries, there emerged a series of what was described as semi-peripheral countries. And these semi-peripheral countries were able to some degree at least, reproduce the strategies that allowed for the elites in the capitalist countries to establish the class-based society that characterizes the core countries: the United States, Japan, Germany, England, France. Canada, by and large, is seen as a core country. It's a bit trickier than that, but basically, Canada is a core country. And so I guess I will wrap it up there. So next week, I will wrap up I'll wrap up my account of world systems theory, and then I will summarize the contrast between modernization theory and world systems theory. Okay, so that's the end of our hour together. And so I will turn off the recording now.